Hi again, this is Taryn, student with Medical Physiology 1010, and today I will be discussing hormonal control of the non-gravid female reproductive cycle. So the female reproductive cycle is cyclic in nature, occurring about one time per month following puberty. The average cycle lasts about 24 to 35 days with an average of 28 days long. The cycle is normally referred to as the menstrual cycle, and it begins with the menstrual cycle because it's a significantly observed portion of menstruation. The cycle is under control of several hormones, which typically exhibit negative feedback control, but there is some events where positive feedback plays a part. A woman's cycle can be described in two ways. You have the ovarian cycle, which describes the changes that are occurring at the ovaries. And second, we have the ability to describe the uterine cycle, which follows the changes that occur in the uterus as the uterus prepares for implantation of a fertilized egg. Specifically the changes that are within the endometrial lining. And each cycle is marked by three phases. The ovarian has the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. And the uterine cycle will have menses, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. And there's a lot of overlap and commonalities between each of those cycles. The menstrual cycle is under hormonal control, largely via the hypothalamus anterior pituitary portal, and it's notable that menstruation will not occur until puberty, when that hypothalamus anterior pituitary pathway matures itself. In this cycle, the hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is a tropic hormone. It influences the anterior pituitary to then secrete follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from it. Those hormones travel in the blood and influence the ovaries to secrete estrogen, progesterone, inhibin, and anti-Mullerian hormone, AMH, from the ovary. I will discuss these hormones and their release in greater detail in the following slides. So this picture is taken from our text, the Silverthorne text, and it shows the overlap of ovarian and uterine cycles and phases within the menstrual cycle, as well as gonadotropin and hormone levels within that same cycle. It shows that the total cycle here, which is standard from 0 to 28 days, so the cycle is 28 days long. It begins with day 1 of menstruation, which is an obvious marker and can be easily identified by the woman. Menstruation is defined as the sloughing of cells from the epithelial lining of the endometrium, which is the inner lining of the uterus, with bleeding. It makes up the early follicular phase of the ovarian cycle and lasts typically 3 to 7 days of that early follicular phase. And if we take a look at the picture of the uterine cycle here, we see the decrease in the size, the depth of the lining of the uterus with that sloughing of cells. In the early follicular phase, gonadotropin secretion, which is follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, influence the growth of granulosa and thecal cells. So they begin to secrete the anti-Mullerian hormone. This AMH in turn reduces the responsiveness of granulosa cells to FSH and isolates a single follicle to develop. And here we see the dominant follicle forming throughout the follicle phase. Androgen secretion, specifically estrogen, acts via negative feedback on follicle-stimulating hormone and LH secretion. As estrogen levels increase, menstruation ends and the endometrium begins to grow again. This growth of the uterine lining signifies entry into the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle and entry of the mid to late follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. And here we see estrogen increasing and an increase in the size and depth of the lining of the uterus. The single dominant follicle then begins to secrete its own hormones of estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. Immediately prior to ovulation, estrogen levels increase greatly, and this elevated increase of estrogen causes a positive feedback response rather than negative feedback on gonadotropin releasing hormone. This causes a rapid surge in the luteinizing hormone, and the secretion of inhibin as well slows the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. With high luteinizing hormone concentrations, oocytes enter the final stage of maturation and meiosis resumes. The developing follicle will become the primary oocyte and then secondary oocyte. Also, high estrogen has increased the endometrium thickness, which is indicative of the proliferative phase and moving on into the later phases. We've now reached this midpoint here around day 14 where estrogen is high and luteinizing hormone is high and ovulation has occurred. Ovulation is indicated by the release of the egg from the follicle, which is about 16 to 24 hours after luteinizing hormone peaks. Following ovulation, the follicle undergoes a transformation into the corpus luteum, which is indicative of the luteal phase in the ovarian cycle. In the early to mid-luteal phase, the corpus luteum secretes increasing amounts of progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. Progesterone is the dominant hormone and peaks around day 21, about 3/4 of the way through the cycle. At that point, estrogen shows a decline, seen here, followed by a short increase but does not reach its peak levels again. Both hormones act via negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and begin to reduce the secretion of LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary. In the uterine cycle, progesterone aids in the progressive thickening of the endometrium as the uterus prepares for any possible implantation of a fertilized zygote or blastocyst, among other preparations for milk production. What is notable is that ovulation is recognized by a rise in body temperature caused by progesterone, which allows women to track whether or not their ovulation has occurred and is can be a good marker for becoming pregnant or avoiding becoming pregnant. The corpus luteum typically only lasts about 12 days after its development, after ovulation, and without fertilization in the late luteal phase, it does begin to degenerate. As we know, the placenta would normally take over or continue the corpus luteum's growth until it could take over. Without fertilization, the degeneration, progesterone and estrogen levels begin to decrease, and their negative feedback on the gonadotropins begins to decline as well, and therefore follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone begin to increase in concentrations. As progesterone levels decline, we know that it is very important for the growth and maintenance of the lining of the uterus, the endometrium. And without it, the endometrium begins to die from the inner layers first, and then begins to slough off. This is about 2 days after the corpus luteum degeneration and about 14 days after ovulation. So we're nearing day 28 at this point. This slide depicts the feedback mechanisms the hormones play through the menstrual cycle, much to which I have just discussed. Under A here, we have the early to mid follicular cycle. We see follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone influencing the granulosa cells and the thecal cells to secrete AMH, androgens, and estrogens. The low levels of estrogen exert a negative feedback, which is very characteristic of estrogen, on gonadotropin secretion, both at the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. But as we see the estrogen levels increase, it promotes more secretion by the follicle. In the late follicular phase and leading into ovulation in section B here, estrogen levels continue to rise with secretion by the follicle, and a shift occurs on how estrogen acts on the gonadotropin secretion. When it reaches high levels, positive feedback begins to occur on gonadotropin releasing hormone, and we see a rapid surge in that luteinizing hormone. It is indicated by the positive little plus signs. As we have just covered, follicle stimulating hormone is inhibited by the secretion of inhibin, and the surge in luteinizing hormone causes maturation of the oocyte and initiates ovulation and that beginning of resuming of meiosis. Following ovulation, we see the formation of the corpus luteum and further preparation by the uterus to prepare for implantation and pregnancy. This is done via secretion of estrogen, progesterone, inhibin, all from the corpus luteum, and secretion of these hormones inhibits the gonadotropin secretion via negative feedback shown in C there. Around 12 days after ovulation, the corpus luteum begins to degenerate without fertilization and the development of that placenta. With its decline, we see a decrease in estrogen and progesterone. Their decrease slows downstream negative feedback on gonadotropins, and as FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone secretion gradually resumes, we near the end of the luteal phase and the beginning of a new cycle. So with the end of the luteal phase, we see that degeneration of the corpus luteum begins a reset of gonadotropin levels and the beginning of the sloughing and decrease in the thickness of the endometrial lining. Once that menstruation cycle begins, the cycle has reset and we're at day 0 or 1. Menses typically lasts 3 to 7 days into the follicular phase, during which the uterus discharges an estimated total of 75 milliliters of blood, fluid, and cellular debris. The menstrual cycle continues on for about 40 years following puberty, and the woman, once that ends, the woman begins to enter menopause, and they are no longer fertile. That's the conclusion of my discussion of the reproductive system of a non-gravid female and the cycle through hormonal control. Thank you.